Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Still, Will is doing great. Everybody else, we get some work on this. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Much better. We're going to get there, I promise. So we're going to continue on our study in Hebrews, and we're going to get into Hebrews chapter 7 today. And this is going to be really weird for me, so I apologize that I'm probably not going to finish everything I want to talk about, and that's going to drive me crazy, but that's all right. We'll get through it. So chapter 7, there's really this... He's really been kind of going back and forth, in the study. Back in Hebrews chapter 2, he starts mentioning Jesus as our high priest, particularly, again, talking to the Jewish Christians of the time. So he's talking to them about that in chapter 2, and he kind of breaks off to a different subject. And he comes back to it just a little bit in chapter 5, but he stops there. And he stops there because he realizes that they're not ready to hear what he's about to say in this particular part of his letter. So what he's getting ready to talk about here is what exactly gives Jesus' priesthood more validity or more authority than the Levitical priesthood that they had just come out of. He spent some time talking about it all, but now it's time to kind of explain it to make sure that it logically makes sense to them. And that's the good thing about the word here, is that it does make logical sense. He's just going to take some time explaining it, and he's going to have just a little bit of time going on with it. So what he looks at is a bunch of people, a bunch of Christians who are interested. They accepted Jesus, and now they're not so sure about things. So he's going to back that up a little bit, and he's going to try to work out these intellectual objections, as I heard it put once, to it. Well, it doesn't make sense that he should be priest. Well, okay, now let's explain why it does. And so that's what he's going to spend some time in the next couple chapters working on. And so in the verse 1 of chapter 7, he says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of kings and blessed him. And to Abraham apportioned and to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever." Now this goes back into the time Abraham has been running around doing his thing, and there was a point where he had to go into battle. He goes to war with some kings, and he comes back from this, and he has all the spoils of this. And he meets up with Melchizedek, who is the king and the priest there at what will be in the future Jerusalem. Salem, the city there. And so he meets him. And it's interesting, he is called the priest of the Most High God. He was not just simply somebody who worshiped God. There were plenty of people who worshiped God. It wasn't just Abraham's little nation running around in the desert that was worshiping God. But there were plenty of people that worshiped God. But here we have Melchizedek being the priest of the Most High God. He had that title, and there was some greatness to his priesthood, that he would be recognized this way. And what's interesting is that, again, let's look back real quick at the relationship between the Jews and Abraham. They were his descendants. They were proud of this. Jesus had to combat this every once in a while in conversation. This whole children of Abraham thing. And sure, it's a wonderful thing to have the civic pride and the heritage pride of your lineage. That's great. Love that. But they had relied on it a bit too much. But just kind of looking at it here, they were really proud of being children of Abraham. It was just something they held on to. But what he's talking about here is suddenly Abraham comes across this priest one day, and he says here that this priest blessed him. Now this actually, kind of interestingly enough, brings up an order of authority, or a pecking order, so to speak. In order for Melchizedek to actually be able to bless Abraham, Melchizedek would have to be of higher authority than Abraham at the time. He was a priest of the Most High God. Abraham was a patriarch of his family, which made him responsible for his family, but the priest of the Most High God really kind of over all those families when you get down to it. And so he's kind of getting this point here. There was someone greater than Abraham? Someone that, it even says here in a moment, that gave tithes to him. But he says there that he blessed him. So in order to bless him, he had to be of higher rank or higher authority than him. And it even shows more than that, because again, we said there just a second ago that Abraham gave him a tenth. Abraham tithed to him. Abraham saw his authority and gave him a tenth of what he had. And so even Abraham, it wasn't just a matter of Melchizedek stepping up and go, I'm a little higher than you, let me bless you. No, this was also Abraham looking at him and going, I owe you as a priest of the Most High God something. And so he would give that over into his service. And this tenth part of all, everything he took from the spoils of the battle and everything he had even before that. So he gives all of this to him. And he gives it again to the King of Righteousness, as his name is translated. Melchizedek is the two words that make up, as we call it, Melchizedek. It's lazy English, I guess. But Melchizedek, the King of Righteousness, and because he was the King of Salem, he was also the King of Peace. So it's interesting there. Now, he even talks a little bit more about it, this idea of being without father and without a mother and without a genealogy. There are a lot of people who will take this and say, well, Melchizedek must have been Jesus incarnate. No evidence towards that. It's a neat and romantic idea, but there's no evidence towards that. Really, the language used here is more so, it's not he didn't have a father or a mother, but that we don't know who he is. And we spent some time on this back in Genesis talking about Melchizedek, so we're not going to, beat that one up anymore. But the idea that it's just, there's no record of it. And it was important, seemingly, that there wasn't any record of it. But it is important to notice that he says that he was resembling the Son of God. The word that's kind of used there is this Greek word that really isn't used anywhere else in the New Testament. It's suggestive. It's this idea of a copy. And so he was the foreshadow of it. And he would establish this priesthood that Jesus is going to be coming in the order of. And so he goes again, we'll kind of step into verse 4. We'll come back to all those points. This bounces around a little bit. But in verse 4 he says, see how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office had a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior, and that in the one case tithes are received by mortal man, but in the other case by one of whom is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. So again, it says, you see how great this man is? I love this phrase. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch. He gives that title to him that gives some weight to Abraham's name. But then he gives more weight to Melchizedek's name by saying that he gave the spoils to him, how great this man was. And it's interesting, he kind of goes back and he's going to give the example again that they were under the Jewish law to give a tenth of what they had to the priesthood. That's how the priests survived. That's how they lived. That's how they made their money, I guess is one way to put it. They lived off the tithes of the people. That's what kept the temple up and running. That's what kept the tabernacle up and running when that was the case. So they would get all of this. And it's interesting that he throws out this setup here. He says all the brethren paid tithes to their brother Levi. But Levi, he kind of even goes into genetics here. You might even say, he says, you might say that Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek because Levi was in his ancestors' loins. Genetically, the family has always paid tithes to Melchizedek because the family paid tithes to the Levites. The Levites, well, they were all descended from Aaron, who was descended from Abraham, who paid tithes to Melchizedek, and that makes Melchizedek's priesthood greater than the Levitical priesthood. Interesting concept he throws out there. It's interesting, he's kind of making an allegorical point. Don't take it too literally on this, but he's kind of making that allegorical point. But the well that he says there that the lesser is blessed by the greater, or that the inferior is blessed by the superior, says that Melchizedek was indeed greater than Abraham. And this is kind of a hard pill for a few of the Jewish people to swallow because, again, they are children of Abraham. We have never been in bondage to anyone. You remember that saying while they were currently in bondage to the Romans. But there they were, kind of getting this pill. And so Melchizedek, giving the blessing, showed himself to be greater than Abraham. Abraham, when giving the tithes, showed himself to be inferior to Melchizedek. Now we're going to talk about this new priesthood. He's making a bunch of points, and he's going to tie them all together here in a little bit. So this new priesthood he talks about, starting in verse 11, he says, "Now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to rise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named after the order of Aaron?" Now again, why would there be a different priesthood if the priesthood they were used to was good enough? It's kind of like, hey, you're living in a really nice apartment now, but that's not the house you're going to. The apartment is not your end goal here. But he says here that this order of Melchizedek, there was something lacking because this order of Melchizedek was greater. It means that the order of the Levitical priesthood was less than. It wasn't as powerful. It didn't mean quite as much. Now, it doesn't mean it didn't mean a lot, just not as much. And so these people received the law under that, the Mosaical law. The priesthood of Melchizedek didn't have the Mosaical law. Actually, it's interesting that the priesthood of Melchizedek was a bit more direct than the Mosaical law. The people would have to get the law from somebody else. There was an intermediary, while Melchizedek, he kind of gets the right there. He kind of gets more of that relationship that's closer. But he says there in verse 12, "For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well." And this is where we're just going to start stepping into as we've changed the law. We had the patriarchal law where God spoke to the fathers and the patriarchs of the family. You had the Mosaical law where he speaks to the priest. He spoke to Moses and the leaders of the nation. And then you have this new law where he speaks to us, right to us. But so there's a change in it, and now we're going to start talking about this new law a little bit. We're going to talk about the new priesthood, the new law, and how that works out. So with this new law comes a new kind of a step, I don't want to call it a step back, but a reach back into a better priesthood. He's going to talk about Melchizedek, and this is in verse 13 he talks about it. He says, "For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe." This is also interesting. In his lead up to all of this, he's not specifically talking about Jesus. You notice he's not mentioning his name. He says, "the one of whom these things are spoken." He's going to kind of bring them to it. He says, "From which no one has ever served at the altar." He belonged to another tribe. "For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priest." And so this person who comes along to take this order, to take this priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, he's going to note here that you're right. He's not a Levite. He was from the tribe of Judah. Then he says that of the law of Moses said nothing about priests. Nobody but a Levite was allowed to become a priest under the Mosaical law here on earth. So he talks about him. He comes from another tribe. He comes from Judah's lineage. And that, of course, we know as he's talking about now, that is Jesus came from Judah. So now he talks about this idea. Now we have this priest. We have a new high priest who's not of the tribe of Levite. He's after a priesthood of another. So he talks about this order of Melchizedek again in verse 15. He says there, "This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, 'You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.'" Now, I just want to start getting into the heavy part of this. The problem here that they would have seen with this is Jesus as a high priest, well, it doesn't fit with what they're used to. Because the high priest was decided by legality, by who your father was. You, if you weren't of the right family, could not become high priest. Unless under the Roman government you bought your way in. I don't think that really had much authority. But that happened when the priesthood became political later on. But this idea says that, the legal requirement concerning bodily descent, if you weren't from the right family, you weren't making it. But by the power, he says, they're of an indestructible life. And therefore it's prophesied of him that you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. How powerful that is to look back as he's establishing the authority of Melchizedek, and then comes in and says this priest is after that order. It has nothing to do with the bodily lineage or genetics or family ties. It's all about the authority when he says about this indestructible life. And again, that kind of notes back to the idea that Melchizedek doesn't have a recorded ending, and neither does Jesus. So he says there, we'll continue on in verse. I'm like rushing through a lot of stuff. Man, this is a lot of weird stuff. But anyway, we covered a lot of it back talking about Melchizedek in Genesis again. But in verse 18 he continues on, for on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. And so he says there, this law was weak and useless. That was kind of a translation for it. The other translations are a little bit different and a little more kind. But the idea is that at this point, it couldn't really do anything. What it did was shadow the law to come. What it did was get another stepping stone on the way, to prepare the people, to prepare the world. But in the end, he says the reason that he uses the harsh kind of term of weak and useless is that because it couldn't make anything perfect. We've covered this before, and we'll step on it again a time or two. The idea that the blood of bulls and goats could not forgive sins. It would take a perfect sacrifice, and there were so many lackings in the old law, which were put there on purpose. It was designed to be, something to prepare for the perfect law. But because of this new law that could make something perfect, we have this better hope. Will?
Well, I was just thinking, the law pointed out sin because Paul said that I didn't know there was a sinner, but the law pointed it out to me.
Yeah. And so he steps here and he starts talking. He's going to, couldn't make anything perfect, but now we're going to, again, skip to another point. And again, he's going to tie it all back together here in a minute. But he kind of skips to another point because he says there in verse 20, after saying this, and it was not without an oath. For those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. And literally, again, he kind of steps back to the priesthood. He was like, okay, great, you're my oldest son. Meet your new high priest. Now, in this case, we find, though, that God wasn't, swearing. He wasn't individually coming down and swearing on these people, but he did hear with Jesus that the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. And he sets him up after this order of Melchizedek, making the greater priesthood, which again was something that they were having some trouble with. And it's important to notice in verse 22 how he says that this makes Jesus, he's finally mentioning his name, okay? The one who came, the one who was doing this, you are a priest forever. He says, this makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant, a better law, a better agreement. And so here's this surety. One translation uses it, the guarantor. It describes, this word kind of describes someone who gives the security for it. I promise you, I am the one who is saying, this is true, this is right. It's kind of like being the bondsman for when Candy goes and gets her notary done. I got to go sign paperwork with her saying that I'm a landowner and yes, I do this, and I sign a bond so that if she messes up and lies in her duties as a notary, I'm responsible. I offered the guarantee that she will do her job properly and that the agreement she makes is proper. Jesus is that surety for us. He offered and he put the bond for us that says that, yes, this is a proper and better covenant, a better agreement that's going on. And so this better covenant, this better agreement, so much better than the old law. And it's easy for us to look at it, having, for the most part in our lives, been raised up in the new law, to see how great it is, and then to kind of look down on the old law. And the purpose is not to look down on it. Because again, for quite some time, it was the true religion. So don't look down on it. But look at it and notice, at least intellectually, that it did have flaws, and they were flaws that were designed into it because it wasn't meant to be perfect. Again, it's kind of like the discussions we have with our children as we're raising them up. There are lots of subjects that the kids will ask me about, and I don't explain it to them exactly as I know it how to be. Why? Because I've spent some time in school, I've spent some time with some books, and I can tell you why certain things happen and why the stove gets hot when you turn the knob and what's happening and the resistance that causes this vicious cycle that changes the resistance and changes. I don't go into that because they're not ready for that. What they get is the imperfect answer that says, because when you turn it on, it runs electricity through it and it gets hot. Now, at some point, if they're not satisfied with that answer, maybe we'll get into resistance and changing in heat and all this good stuff. That's great and that's wonderful. But they're not ready for that. They're 9 years old. Humanity was not ready for the law we live under now at that time. So it was given what we can look at as a flawed answer, a very simple answer. Not the, why don't I stick this fork into the outlet? It was simply a law that said, do not stick the fork in the outlet. Well, why can't we have this cooked and prepared a certain way? Just don't. That was kind of the answer they're going, because I said so. And as we can go back, we can look and say, okay, we understand better. It was more about the heart and more about things creeping into their lives is why they weren't allowed to prepare a calf in its mother's milk. We understand those were sacrificial things that were done to other gods, and you weren't supposed to do that because it bled into your system, and we can get all into that. We understand that because Jesus came and talked more about what goes on in the heart, what goes on in the mind, versus just the action of thou shalt not stick the fork in the outlet. We understand the danger of why not to do that. Humanity wasn't ready for it, so therefore it was what we would consider to be an imperfect law. Not necessarily that it wasn't what God needed to be, but that it wasn't everything we wanted to know. We have a little more of that today. So we have more about the mind of God, more about what he would have, and that makes it a better covenant. Because it's not just an understanding of God said, thou shalt not do this, but God said, don't do this, and here's why. And he gives us a lot of reasons for everything. Not everything, but for a lot of things. And so now he talks a bit about in chapter 7 and verse 23 about an unchanging priesthood. So now that we understand that Jesus is this priest forever, there's something else that lasts forever. And that's the atonement that we get because of it. Because if you remember, they had to offer sacrifices every year. And it wasn't just for the sins that they had committed since the last sacrifice. It was every sin they had ever committed. Because they couldn't be forgiven. They could simply just kind of be pushed back out of the way by these atoning sacrifices. But now we have this priest forever. Again in verse 23, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Why did there have to be so many priests? Because after so many years, they died. They moved on. That was the case. Jesus here, he lives forever. His priesthood lives forever. It's not as if you have to get used to a new leadership in the church, because the leadership never changes. There he is, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. There, he's always there. He's always has that. And because of that, he can always make intercession for us. And sadly, the priesthood, the earthly priesthood in the law of Moses would become political. And that Brian could become closer to the priest than Neville, and Neville would have less access to things. But then one day, the priest that just loves Brian dies, and suddenly it's Tom's favorite priest, and this would become corrupt like this. This doesn't change. We don't have a priesthood that decides, we got a new priest, and he's going to do things just a little differently on how he talks to people. Doesn't happen. He's the same priest. He hasn't changed. He talks to us all the same. He holds us all the same as his brothers and as his family. And so, again, it's more stable. Even look at it as we're changing over in the next few months. The presidency is going to a new person. They have to abide by the same laws. President Trump has to abide by the same laws that President Obama did. He's going to abide by them slightly differently. He's going to say things differently. He's going to do things differently. He is going to make decisions differently. And the same thing happened with the priest until Jesus comes along as our high priest. He doesn't do things differently from year to year. There's no shadow of turning. There's no variableness in him. It is simply, this is what I need you to do. This is what I've done for you. This doesn't change. And so he's constantly, says, he always lives to make intercession for us. He continues on forever, and that's just an amazing thing. And he goes on, finishing out chapter 7, he says in verse 26, "For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever." He says there it's fitting that we should have a high priest who is the perfect example, someone who is holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. No high priest in history under the Mosaical law could claim any of those. He says they're one who doesn't need to worry about himself before he worries about us. Esteem others more highly than yourselves. That's exactly what he did. He did not have to put us aside for a few moments while he made a sacrifice for himself. He didn't have to. He was perfect. He was clean, holy, and unstained. Therefore, when it came time to make the sacrifice for us, it was all about us. It didn't have to be anything about him in that sacrifice. And the priest, unfortunately, that everybody was used to, they did. They couldn't sacrifice for the people till they had sacrificed for themselves. They had to put the people aside, take care of themselves, and then come back to the people. Jesus, on the other hand, spent his time, all of his time, on us. And that's just an amazing thing. It says that the oath appointed a son who has been made perfect forever. He didn't have to then. He doesn't have to now. He doesn't have to sit at the right hand of God and go, "Okay, Father, I have a couple things I have to confess and get off and get cleaned up here before I can talk to these things that Steve needs to talk to you about." It's simply, my adopted brother Steve needs you for this. And it doesn't have to be about him. Now, all the praise, all the glory, all the honor goes to him, but none of the sacrifice is for him. All the sacrifice was for us, and that was something the Levitical priest couldn't offer. They had to worry about themselves first before they could even go in to make the offering for them. Okay, that's Melchizedek in 25 minutes.
The word of the oath, is that God affirming Jesus, or what did your study show?
The several times where God would, especially in the Gospels, would talk, "This is my son in whom I will please." In the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and such, he says, "You listen to him." And I failed to write down the reference I was thinking of when he says there that you are a priest forever. Several Old Testament prophecies step up into this idea, and there's a couple more that we'll see here in this idea of a new covenant or a better covenant in chapter 8. But these times when God would have the prophets prophesy about this new priest, when you would find Moses even prophesying, talking about there's someone coming greater than me, even Abraham would speak to some degree about better things to come in his faith. And so lots of references, and I kind of feel bad now that I didn't write them all down, but I'm sure I can find some and come back to them. So these prophecies were just, they're all over the place. It wasn't just one time he says, "Okay, this." They're peppered throughout it, as far as that his perfection being much greater than what was already there. And even the people that would flock to John the Baptist, looking to him more than they would look to the priests that were there at the time. Even John would say, "There comes another who I'm not worthy to loosen his shoes up." You think about, what a mundane task it is to untie your shoes at the end of the day. If you could just hire someone to untie your shoes, that would be great, wouldn't it? Because that would mean so many other things were done first. But here he says, "I'm not worthy to be the servant who would take his shoes off his feet." And so there was always, everybody who stepped up as a leader of God's people in one way or another, that were righteous about it and that were doing what God wanted them to do about it, always mentioned somebody greater is coming. Always mentioned this idea that something better than me, something better than what I have is coming. and watch out for it. And Jesus was the only one who ended up saying, all authority is given to me, in heaven and earth. This is what we were looking for. This is what we were keeping an eye out for. This is what we were preparing for you. And it hasn't changed. It's been there.
Also, Melchizedek seems to be almost like an angelic being in that he lived forever, typified as a being who lived forever. So it's almost when Abraham gave to Melchizedek, he was giving to God. And then the priesthood of Jesus coming in, and the tithes or offerings, whatever we give, is not to a local institution, but it's actually to a heavenly being.
Yes.
It's amazing when you connect that to our offering today.
And when you look at the offering, it really is. It's not a matter of we're giving money to the Summit Church of Christ. We're not giving food or clothing or whatever it is that we can give. When we do give, we're not giving it to the Summit Church of Christ. We're not giving it to the elders. What we are doing is giving it to the care of them, because they're doing what's there for God. All of this belongs to God. This is not our microphone, which is about to fall out of the holder. This is not our microphone. This is God's microphone. We decide how to use it and spreading God's word. It works really well for this room. We have other tools for spreading the word in other places. But all of those things belong to God. And just as these tithes that he would pay, the same with ours. And if you really want to have some fun, you can also say that the priesthood of Melchizedek, as it works there, because you had the patriarchal law and the Mosaical law running parallel to each other at one time. There were faithful, godly people worshiping God, sacrificing to him, that weren't Jews at the time. It was just merely this family needed to be the way it was so that this line could happen the way God wanted it to happen. There were still people. There were prophets of God that weren't Jews. Even if he wasn't a good one, Balaam. He wasn't a great guy all the time, but there he was a prophet of God, and he wasn't Jewish. So it's kind of weird, and we talked again a little bit about that back in Genesis when we particularly looked at Melchizedek. So and we'll kind of move on just a little bit, because I'm going to have to start splitting lessons if I want to get all the way through it. So we'll continue on in chapter 8, now that he's brought this idea into this better new covenant, as we divided it up. In chapter 8 and verse 1, he says, now the point in what we are saying is this. So I just want to wrap it all up. He's made all these points. Let's bring them all together and make a basket out of them. It says, we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, and the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. And this last part here, that the Lord set up, not man. It's the temple. It's built by a bunch of workmen. The tabernacle was built by a bunch of workmen. Where he is now was not built by a bunch of workmen. It's simply where God is. It's the tent that the Lord set up. So he says there, what we're made, this whole point here, he says that we have a high priest seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And there's an interesting idea here I was reading about here. When the high priest would go into the holy place, okay, what was in there? You had a table. On the table was the showbread. You had the lampstands and, the incense burning. Any chairs? No chairs? I didn't find any barca loungers in the holy place or in the most holy place or even in the temple. The furniture was said, thou shalt have this furniture, and no chairs were there. It's kind of interesting that the priesthood here on earth never got to sit down because their work was never done. However, what did Jesus say on the cross? It is finished. He gets to sit down. He gets, his work here on earth was done. All the work he has now is simply listening and relaying. Listening to us, relaying to God. That's as our intermediary, as our intercessor. But there he gets to sit at the right hand of God, and then I don't know, maybe that might be a little more importance than it looks there, but it's just kind of interesting that the priest here on earth, there was no place for them to sit in their job as an intermediary between the Jewish people and God. Jesus has a place to sit, and it's a place of authority at the right hand.
In a way, his disciples realized that because they said, when you come into your kingdom, can we sit on your right?
Yeah. And it was always a place of power there. But he says there that we have that high priest who sits in a holy place, who serves in a holy place, not that man set up, but that God set up. He says in verse 3, for every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifice. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Priests offer sacrifice. They sacrifice things. So therefore this priest was going to have to offer something. And what he says there, and continuing on in verse 4, says, now if he were here on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you in the mountain. Again, we said this earlier. If his priesthood were here on earth, he wouldn't be a priest. He wasn't a Levite. It just wasn't there. But his priesthood is not here on earth. His sacrifice was on earth. His priesthood is in heaven, in the heavenly places where God has it there. So he mentions there that this pattern, this shadow of heavenly things, again, going back to the old law, that the old law was just a shadow of these things. It wasn't the perfect image of a thing. It was merely a shadow. And most of the time when you look at a shadow, you can tell what the thing is. But here was what was coming would be perfect. It would be the perfect image of it. And so because he has this pattern, that this pattern was based on him, we step into verse 6. He says, but as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. And this one sentence says a lot of things. A much more excellent covenant, a better mediator, and better promises. Their promises where you follow my law and you'll be fine. You won't have to worry about invading nations. You'll be prosperous. You'll have all the things you need in order to live a nice, well-rounded life. Well, it's a great promise. We have a better promise. You follow me. You do what I need you to do, and you don't have to worry about anything, because in the end, you'll have it all. It'll be perfect. There won't ever be a need to get anything else. It's a better promise, the better mediator, one who has, again, doesn't have to speak for himself. He speaks for us. A much better mediator. Not somebody who has to explain, what he was doing before he can talk about what we've done. We don't have to worry about that. And this more excellent covenant, this agreement, is amazing, because what was the penalty for touching the Ark of the Covenant? Did you get a second chance at that? Uzzah, he touched it like 2 or 3 times and got, I'm warning you. I'll get you at some... No, that didn't happen. He touched it with great intentions and was struck dead. That was the covenant. You touch it, you die. A covenant is just an agreement. God here says that, our new covenant, the one that Jesus brought to us, is so much better, because I tell you honestly, by the old law, I should be dead a long time ago. But in the new law, the new covenant, God is patient. He wants us to come to repentance. He even offers the repentance of it. Uzzah didn't have a chance to repent of the crime he committed against God. I have. I don't rely on that, because, there may come a time when I don't have a chance to repent of that. But a more perfect law, a more perfect and a more excellent covenant, a better agreement quite frankly, for us. I don't really know that it makes anything better for him to have that agreement with us, but he does have it with us, that not only can we is a bad word, if we mess up what he's given us, we have the opportunity to fix it. Unlike so many people, Nadab and Abihu, they messed up, that they didn't do the agreed actions for their worship. They were struck dead. I love our covenant being so much better. It's more, it's favorable to us, as it's put in one place. And so, it's just something to really look at when we look at the old law versus the new. And here he was trying to convince them, the things you left, man, the things you have now are so much better. I mean, because again, the fear with these folks that he was talking to at the time was that they were trying to go back to that. They were trying to go back to a law where when you did the wrong thing, you were struck dead. When they already had a law now that when you did the wrong thing, you were not guaranteed, but typically able to get an opportunity to get forgiveness of it. Neville, then we'll close up.
There's also compassion
in
the old law, but there's some things that there wasn't compassion if you touched holy things. When you touch the offering, as in Ananias and Sapphira lying about it, justice was swift. So in some senses, there's more compassion than others. Obviously, the law covered by the grace in the New Testament is amazing. Nothing like that in the Old Testament.
Yeah, the compassion of it's amazing. I mean, you think about some of the sins, your neighbors were to have no compassion on you whatsoever. You were to be stoned.
Yes.
And now we have compassion on each other. Neville, I saw that you did something, and I know that's not right. I want to talk to you about it. I want to work this out with you. Versus, 2,000 years ago, it was more like, Neville, saw what you did. Pick up my rocks and go at him. And it's very different. So we'll continue on there and finish up, Lord willing, chapter 8, and then get chapter 9 in as well, hopefully next week. And we'll be right on track to take care of things. Let's close with a word of prayer real quick. Lord and Father in heaven, thank you so much for today. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to be together to worship you and to study your word. Thankful, dear Lord, for all the many blessings that you give us, the opportunity to be encouraged and to encourage. We pray that you would help us, that we would take everything that we do this morning and give it to your glory, that we might build each other up and that we might magnify your name all through serving you. We ask it all in Christ's name.